If you have enjoyed looking and listening to my books, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Dumbo, Disney's Dumbo, a Ladybird book, first published in 1990. The animals in Mr. Ringmaster's circus were all very excited, for during the night the storks had come visiting, bringing babies to some of the mothers in the circus. Baby giraffe had come first, followed by a giggly baby kangaroo and a hairy baby bear, but there was no baby elephant. Mrs. Jumbo tried hard not to cry. The storks had brought her nothing, and they would not be back for another year. No one noticed how sad she was, for everyone was bustling about and getting ready for a journey. Mr. Ringmaster's circus was moving on to another town, and they all had a train to catch. As the circus train began to pull away, a stork, wearing a postman's hat, suddenly appeared high above. "Special delivery! Special delivery!" he screamed. His wings flapped wildly as he puffed and panted to keep up with the train. In his beak the stork was carrying a bundle. "Mrs. Jumbo!" he cried. "It's for you!" He let go of the bundle, and Mrs. Jumbo stretched out her trunk to catch it safely. Mrs. Jumbo wondered what was inside. Carefully she untied the bundle, and there it was, a baby elephant. "How beautiful he is," she said, cuddling him with her trunk. All the elephants crowded round and came to look at the new arrival. "Isn't he sweet?" they said. But when they looked more closely, they fell silent. Then they began to giggle, and then they began to laugh. "Look at his ears!" called one of them. For instead of neat little elephant ears, Mrs. Jumbo's new baby had enormous pink ones. Mrs. Jumbo glared at the elephants and sent them away. "I'm going to call you Dumbo," she murmured. The baby elephant waggled his ears, settled himself into a comfortable position, and fell fast asleep. Next morning the train stopped and all the animals climbed out. The circus men put up a big tent and the animals lined up in a procession, with Mrs. Jumbo and Dumbo at the back. "This is called the parade," she told Dumbo. "Just follow me." But Dumbo kept falling over his big ears. The people watching the parade laughed at him, and poor Dumbo began to cry. After the parade, some naughty boys came up and began teasing Dumbo. Mrs. Jumbo picked up the leader and gave him a good hard smack with her trunk. She'd only wanted to teach the boy a lesson for being cruel, but the people thought she'd gone mad. They began to scream and run to safety. The circus men came running with ropes. "We'll have to lock her up," shouted one of them. And Dumbo watched in tears as his mother was dragged away. Poor Dumbo didn't understand. No one took any notice of him, and tired and frightened, he crept back to the elephant tent. But the elephants had decided that Mrs. Jumbo had brought disgrace to their good name. They wanted nothing to do with Dumbo and wouldn't even speak to him. So that night Dumbo lay down and cried himself to sleep. Dumbo woke up suddenly. Someone was tickling him. And there, standing in front of him, was a furry little creature wearing a smart red coat and a cap with a feather in it. "I saw everything that happened," he whispered, "and I'm going to help you. But first," he added, I'm going to put the fear of mouse into those stuck-up elephants. The mouse tiptoed towards the elephants. He stood behind them and roared. The elephants went pale. Eek! They screamed, Eek! It's a mouse! Eek! The mouse stood in the middle of the tent, roaring away, and the elephants fled in terror. The mouse grinned at Dumbo. I'm Timothy Mouse, he said. I may be small, but I can cause big trouble. And now, he said, adjusting his hat, we're going to set your mother free. Dumbo told Timothy about how the people laughed at him. Timothy examined the elephant's ears. He said, putting his head to one side to think. At last he snapped his fingers. I've got it, he said. We'll make you into a star, and then they'll do anything for you. So that night, when Mr. Ringmaster lay sound asleep, Timothy crept up and whispered into his ear, Your circus needs a star jumbo. Your star should be my friend Dumbo. Mr. Ringmaster woke up the next morning full of a marvellous idea he'd had during the night. Dumbo was going to be his new star. So he ordered the elephants to make a huge elephant pyramid. Then Jumbo was to jump off a high trapeze and land on top of them all. All went well in rehearsal, but during the show, nothing went right. Dumbo knocked the elephants over and they all came crashing down in a heap. Mr. Ringmaster was angry and he sent Dumbo to bed without any supper. You're no good at being a star, said Mr. Ringmaster the next day, but you can make people laugh. Go and work with the clowns. Dumbo hated his new job. He was scared when the clowns made him jump through some flames down into a tub of water. But the people watching the show thought it was very funny, and the clowns decided to keep Dumbo in their act. Dumbo was very sad, so that night when everyone else was fast asleep, Timothy Mouse took Dumbo to see his mother. Dumbo put his trunk through the window and gave a soft whimper. Mrs. Jumbo was so pleased to see him, and she cuddled him with her long trunk until it was time to say good night. Goodbye, she whispered. Be good. And Dumbo went back to the circus. Now the clowns had opened a bottle of bubbly champagne to celebrate their success, and some of it had spilled into a water barrel outside their tent. On the way home, Timothy and Dumbo were thirsty, so the two friends stopped to have a drink from the water barrel. Afterwards, they began to feel quite giddy. They began to run and jump and dance, and then quite suddenly they felt tired and fell sound asleep. Dumbo woke up the next morning and realized that he and Timothy had been sleeping at the very top of a high tree. Some crows who were perching in the tree thought it was all very funny. How did you get to the top of the tree? Asked one of the crows. Dumbo thought and thought. Then he remembered that he had dreamt that he was flying through the air with Timothy tucked inside his yellow cap. Perhaps you weren't dreaming, said Timothy excitedly. Perhaps you really were flying. He gave Dumbo a feather. Try to fly, he said. You can if you hold on to this magic feather. Dumbo stood at the edge of a cliff and looked down. The crows gave him a push, and suddenly he was flying. Timothy and the crows cheered, for they knew that the feather wasn't really magic, it was just an ordinary feather. Dumbo could really and truly fly. their evening performance, the clowns were going to catch Dumbo on a little trampoline. He had to jump from the top of the tent, but he wasn't frightened any longer. He had his magic feather, and he was going to fly down to the ground. Just at the right moment, he jumped, but to his horror, he dropped the feather. It floated away, and Dumbo began to plunge towards the ground, far below. As Dumbo fell, he heard Timothy's voice shouting to him, "Fly, Dumbo! It isn't a magic feather. You can fly!" And Dumbo started to flap his ears as though they were wings. Soon he was swooping up, up, up to the top of the tent. The crowd gasped in amazement. They had never seen anything so wonderful. Dumbo was the new star of the circus, just as Timothy had promised. Soon crowds were flocking to Mr. Ringmaster's circus to see the flying elephant. Mr. Ringmaster was delighted, and Mrs. Jumbo was set free. From then on, the two elephants were given their own comfortable carriage to travel in, all to themselves. Well, not quite themselves, for tucked comfortably inside Dumbo's cap was Timothy Mouse. After all, he was Dumbo's best friend.